Wraith is here, ladies and gentlemen, and boy is he interesting. He is a really odd sort of hero with only one damage dealing ability and his basic attack. Both are scaled very interesting and has some interesting interplays between power, attack speed, even crit. We're going to explore all options in this video, and especially the penetrations. In this video, we're taking a look at Wraith and his math and his stats and how does he work. So, ladies and gentlemen, his basic attack is very interesting. The damage is quite low, 153, gets a lot per hero level at 1.6 per hero level, but has a damage scaling of 0.6. Essentially, what you guys just need to know is his basic attack is basically like a fighter. He is a fighter. And if you guys know anybody else, if you guys have been around, you know that fighters like their attack speed. It's basically just as valuable as power. Now, when we go into the math here, you can see something very, very interesting. When you run varying levels of power and attack speed with Wraith's basic attack, you can actually see with that yellow bar that he really likes his attack speed. It's about a 1-to-1 ratio. It's about a 3-to-4 or a 1-to-1 ratio of attack speed to damage or power. He really likes his attack speed. So when you're just considering his basic attack, because of its 0.6 power scaling and the fact that it doesn't deal overly too much damage in the early game, he really relies on his attack speed to deal that damage. Now, because his basic attack deals basic damage, something else that helps with basic damage is basic penetration. And when we run basic penetration in the mix, he's actually quite interesting. If you have 20 total CP into damage stats, you can see that it's anywhere from a 5 to 6% increase in DPS when you eliminate the armor of a caster or a fighter. 5 to 6% increase when you're only talking about 20 CP into damage stats. Of course, that's pretty low, so when you run the numbers on 30 or 40 CP into damage stats, it actually severely increases. In terms of just his basic attack, remember, just his basic attack, it's 7 to 12% DPS increase with eliminating the basic armor of a fighter or a caster if you have 40 CP into damage stats. If you're in 30 CP into damage stats, that's a 7.5 to 10% DPS increase when in his basic attack department. Very, very interesting. I already knew that the fighters like their basic attack penetration, their basic damage penetration, because of their poor power scaling and their lower damage than carries. No surprise that Wraith also likes basic penetration for his basic attack. Now, we've talked a lot about his basic attack, but what about that other really cool ability, Knock Knock, that pierces through walls and deals a pretty good amount of damage? Well, it deals 230 damage at level 4 and has a 6-second cooldown, but a 2-second cooldown if you manage to last hit a minion or an enemy. This one's really interesting with the power scaling of 1. So 6 power gets 6 damage on his Knock Knock ability. So when you do the math with that ability, you can actually see something quite interesting. You can actually see that with ability pen, in order to increase the damage that this ability does, it doesn't do overly much. For whatever reason, Knock Knock here doesn't like ability pen overly much. If you have 20 CP into damage stats, or just power in this scenario, and ability pen, you can actually see that building ability pen hurts his overall damage from his Knock Knock ability. It actually decreases in damage by 7 damage. Only 7. So if you run up, if you want to consider 30 CP of power or ability pen, or 40 CP of power or ability pen, you can actually see that 40 CP of power if you optimize between power and ability pen, you're only increasing the damage by 19. You're only going to increase the damage from his Knock Knock ability by 5% by giving up a whole bunch of CP to go into ability pen. My opinion on this is that it's simply not worth it. I am going to get rid of 12 CP, 14 CP of power just to increase the damage from one of my abilities by 19 damage. Simply not worth it in my opinion. I'm going to give you my opinion at this point simply because it's not worth it. Happy birthday donation. Thank you very much while we're making this. It is my birthday when I'm making this. Nice big birthday Wraith. Oh, I love it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when we go into our basic attack DPS plus the DPS from our Knock Knock ability, since we now know that basically ability pen is not worth it for that ability, you're only going to consider power on that. We have to think, how do we optimize DPS, or if we wanted to, pardon me, if we wanted to optimize DPS, including our Knock Knock and our basic attack, we need to consider power and attack speed in what we do. So when we do that here, something very, very interesting emerges. When we consider his basic attack DPS and his Knock Knock DPS and make that fluctuate between various amounts of power and various amounts of attack speed, we can actually see something very interesting. We can now see that he prefers a little bit of power and then into some attack speed. This reminds me of exactly every other fighter and even carry in how they build their kit. A little bit of power, your ward and your first card, and then some attack speed. Very, very interesting. We can see that it goes up fairly significantly and that he actually does really like his attack speed. Again, it's a solid 3-to-4 ratio of attack speed to power once you get that little bit of power in the early game. You can see if you have 23 CP of power, you need 14 CP of attack speed. Nice 3-to-4 attack speed power ratio. Very, very interesting. This really tells me that his Knock Knock is really not an overly large part of his kit. Yeah, it snipes and pierces. That is situational in nature, so it's going to shine in its scenario kind of no matter what you put on it. Does that make sense? The viability of his Knock Knock is the situation and not what you build onto it. That's probably the best way I can explain it. So when we take a look at now his different way of building him, something else really emerges. I wanted to compare a burst deck where you just put power versus a DPS deck where you put power and attack speed. Remember, penetration is the same thing as power, it just does something a little bit differently. So again, if you wanted to further optimize these stats or whatever, you simply have to use what I explained earlier to optimize that, as this DPS can increase for both of these stats here. So when we look at a burst deck versus a DPS deck, and yes, viewers wanted to see a 100% crit deck, and you know what? It actually works in my opinion. With 40 CP of power, we're going to assume that we have 40 CP total in our decks beside our 100% crit. That one's going to have 55 CP total vested into damage stats, so of course it's going to deal more damage and DPS and more overall damage. Of course, I just wanted to see what it was. Now, the burst deck is going to have 40 CP of power, 0 attack speed, deal a DPS of 255, and he will basic attack every 1.2 seconds. The DPS deck will deal 304 DPS, about 20% more, but have 17 attack speed and 23 power, and it will be attacking almost twice as fast as its burst counterpart. The 100% crit deck has 12 CP of power, 13 attack speed, obviously 25 5 into crit, 5 into the crit bonus, deal 424 DPS, and attack a point every 0.7 seconds. So when you run the numbers, when you basic attack into a knock-knock, into a whole bunch of basic attacks followed by another knock-knock, this is the overall damage dealt at certain points. This is T-0 is when you first attack. That is when you press the button to attack. All of these other numbers here are when the damage is dealt from the basic attacks and from his 2 snipe abilities. So when T equals 0, the burst deck from a basic attack and a knock-knock deals 681 damage. The DPS deck will only deal 518. So you can see from the just pressing 2 buttons, the burst deck is dealing 100 and about 70 damage more just from pressing 2 buttons. T equals 0. The 100% crit deck actually is nicely in between there, dealing 579. Now, when T equals 0.72 seconds, the DPS deck is already going to have shot another time. It's gonna be dealing 668 damage, which is pretty much exactly the same as the burst damage, as the burst deck. Now, the 100% crit deck, though, will deal 200 more damage in 0.72 seconds and be at 856. When you take a look, the DPS deck needs 0.72 seconds to deal basically as much damage as a burst deck. All the DPS deck needs to do is basic attack twice, and it's done as much damage as the burst deck has. Plus, you're going to get the more reliable application of damage from the basic attacks from the DPS deck. Now, of course, the 100% crit deck just runs away with it. It's dealing like 400 more damage in 6 seconds. In 2.58 seconds mark, it's dealing 300 more damage. It runs away with it incredibly quickly. It takes 2 basic attacks in 0.72 seconds. The 100% crit build is 20-30% more damage output than the others combined. Now, interestingly, yes, of course, the burst deck is going to deal 470 damage per knock-knock per his snipe ability, and his 100% crit is only dealing 302. But you can see, I don't know, is 170 extra damage on his knock-knock, and this is before ability armor of the enemy. Is that worth it? I'm not sure. You know, you can see that the DPS that the DPS deck starts running away with it by the by the 0.72 to 1.96 second mark, and starts to get ahead by a significant amount, 342 damage here by the 5.68 second mark. Of course, by the time the burst deck gets a second snipe off, it's kind of clawing back a little bit of the delta, but the 100% crit starts to run away with it. So very, very interesting. I think I can summarize this, guys, by saying that the burst, yes, it has some potential here to increase the damage that it deals in that instant. One basic attack into a snipe, or even just a snipe, it does have that potential to deal more damage. But personally, I'm not seeing how in this maybe prolonged engagement meta that we are in, especially with him having a long influence that he can kind of just sit back and play a little bit more safe, he will be able to apply damage more over time. And with his power scaling being at 0.6, with his attack speed, with the math relying on attack speed so much, he really needs some attack speed, and I think that fits his role. Wraith, by my investigation, ladies and gentlemen, is basically a long-ranged fighter that, yeah, he's a he's a ranged fighter with one hard-hitting ability. That's Wraith. He's a ranged fighter. So very, very interesting. The rest of his kit makes him super able to work with well-coordinated teams, and I'm really excited to see how he does. Let me know down in the comments, guys, what you guys think of this. How are you going to build Wraith? Ability pens and no-go. Basic pen, yes. You can get a bit of it. What are you gonna do? Are you gonna go burst, or are you gonna go DPS? How much CP are you gonna put into damage stats to maybe so you can go 100% crit? What are you gonna go? Let me know down in the comments. Please like this video if you like it, dislike it if you dislike it, share it with the community, and of course, guys, subscribe. If you guys like this content, especially if you found it useful, please subscribe so I can do it for you in the future. If you would like to support me and what I do on a regular basis, please consider going over to my Patreon account where you can make a monthly pledge to support what I do and reap some pretty good rewards. Till next time, like always, guys, stay optimistic and positive.